Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers. It's broadcast number 749, April the 14th, 1986. I want to update a few items about the the shuttle Challenger and the investigation of this explosion that took place in January of this year. The first article I want to refer to is titled Shuttle Plans, More Military Missions Set. This was published in the New York Times March the 24th, 1986, and was reprinted in the Los Angeles Herald. The gist of this article is that there will be an important shift in the space agency now, that they're going to go to the military flights, and as the shuttle goes, once it is launched again, more and more money and energy and experiments and placements will be for the Defense Department. And the article says that before the explosion took place, before the commission was investigating in NASA the problems, before they identified the causes of the shuttle blowing up, and before they intended or could correct the shuttle errors that caused it to blow up, they were already deciding that the missions for the next years would be military. 33% of the space on the shuttles was military up to the explosion. After the explosion, 75% was going to switch to military. So once again, the teacher in space, the petticoat, was to hide what would happen after the teacher gave her lessons up there. They were ready to increase it. Now, the excuse, of course, is that shifting to military, as I stated, within 1 week after the shuttle exploded, that it was crucial to national security now to shift to Star Wars, that Star Wars comes first. And what I said on the various programs on the shuttle Challenger that I've been doing consecutively ever since the explosion, and after the second week on the broadcast, I said that it was purposely allowed to blow up. I said the Challenger was allowed to explode or even assisted in the explosion, making sure it didn't make a successful launch, that they were to shift from civilian to warfare, and even could dump that rainbow team and now get on with more business and more contracts. This article is a long one, and as many of you might have seen it, on the transfer, and they again refer to the switch to the top priority of the high-technology Star Wars anti-missile system, and it was in March 23rd, 1983, when Reagan and Edward Teller switched and produced the Star Wars, that the deterioration of the shuttle program could begin, and any time after that, let the parts run down. They had plenty of money, but they didn't use it, and they borrowed from each of the different shuttle systems, and then tested it in this very cold weather. And now the intention is, first, the next one is Vandenberg Air Force with the military mission, a Defense Department Navy satellite with British intelligence, a scientific payload with NASA's $1 billion space telescope is going up, some more Defense Department work and tracking and data relay and so forth, so that the scientific and the Defense Department missions will be first, and this story about civilians in space is all a cover. Another important article was in the San Francisco Chronicle this past Sunday, and probably reprinted in the Washington Post. David Ignatius wrote it from the Chronicle. He is the editor of the Washington Post Outlook section. It was printed April 13th, 1986. Low comedy, high tragedy. I don't know why I use the word comedy. In the orgy of blame after the Challenger disaster, the media have pointed the finger at just about everyone but themselves. And there, right there is a big picture of Dan Rather. Well, if it hadn't been for the media, for CNN, showing the on-site launching of the shuttle and being there when it exploded, and then Dan Rather's very good TV coverage with the icicles, and the interviews particularly good. In fact, I cited him on my broadcast and having watched his account of it. Now they're blaming Dan Rather for pushing the launch in weather when they delayed on the 27th and putting them down for not going, and not praising them for being cautious. And the whole gist of this huge article is to blame the media for pressuring NASA when you've heard 2 months, going into 3 months, of the most horrendous stories of parts that were wrong, people from NASA themselves telling you about it, including that death drawer, the death file I referred to. The media is always the whipping boy, so they take their cheapest shot, and Dan Rather and CBS are a big target of the extreme right wing, the very people down there that ordered this thing to go, with the mentality of Jesse Helms and the warfare state. So the picture of Dan Rather and the association that it was the media's fault that all of this happens, that they're under pressure of the media. Last week I mentioned the election in Carmel of the mayor of California, Clint Eastwood, and referred to his contacts, of course, Pebble Beach, owned by Marvin Davis, and Davis's close association with Henry Kissinger, William Rogers, investigating the space shuttle, Gerald Ford, Claire Chennault, and so forth. And I also mentioned Pete Wilson coming into the area to rearrange Big Sur, that there was a combine here from Pebble Beach to Big Sur. That is an important power block to be watched, and they should be watched internationally and nationally, but they're right here in Carmel, California. The same day of the elections, there was an article in the Monterey Herald written by elected officials in the area here asking Pete Wilson to hold off his bill on Big Sur. He just galloped into here. He's from San Diego and was ready to rearrange the protection, in quotes, of Big Sur. And the article said elected officials and Big Sur residents and environmental representatives wrote to Pete Wilson and said, hold off on your proposed Big Sur legislation. The key to preserving Big Sur is understanding not only its magnificent beauty, but acknowledging that preservation can best be carried out by people of the community. And it's signed by Senator Ken Maddie, California State Senator Leon Panetta, the representative from this area, and people from the Board of Supervisors here in Monterey County and Big Sur Land Trust. There are a lot of people that say, really, Mr. Wilson, Senator Pete Wilson from San Diego, the people of the community have to be considered, and what are you doing here? Well, as soon as the election was over this past Sunday, the Monterey Herald had a story on how Clint Eastwood won the election, and it's not separate from the Pete Wilson Big Sur grab that he's trying to make and influence along with the Pebble Beach group. It's all one continuous area. If you get out your map and see the Monterey Peninsula, they're all flow from one to the other and are just miles apart from each other. Pebble Beach links right to Carmel, and you drive to Carmel down the coast, you're right at Big Sur. The Monterey Herald has a story on the political consultants that told Clint Eastwood how to run his campaign, and the Monterey Herald, which is fairly conservative, describes how people moved in this area to ramrod Clint's campaign. One of them was a Mrs. Hutchinson, who came into Carmel in February to ramrod the campaign. She worked with President Reagan and George Dumaijian, the governor of California. She just came to Carmel from Santa Barbara, where she worked to defeat an initiative that would have outlawed offshore oil pipelines. We have a glut of oil all over the world that is causing the prices to drop. There's so much oil. And the group of people running Eastwood's campaign here successfully threw out the ban. They had oil spills there that were killing the fish and the birds and sea life a few years ago up on the beaches. And here at Monterey Peninsula, we have the sea otters and the natural habitat, the shrimps and crabs and sea. Beautiful coast, and they want to put oil wells outside of here. The people that defeated the oil offshore ban in Santa Barbara came up to Carmel to run his campaign. And the paper says, in addition to Mrs. Hutchinson, Eastwood's two political consultants were Arnold Steinberg of Sherman Oaks, that's down in Los Angeles, and Eileen Padberg of Costa Mesa up north, that worked on the Santa Barbara campaign. They were all employed by huge oil companies opposing the initiative which was proposed by the environmentalists. So the environmentalists are saying, Pete Wilson, get out and stand off. We can handle Big Sur. And the environmentalists were opposed by the people running Clint Eastwood's campaign. It goes on to say that the people who helped Mr. Eastwood, including Mrs. Padberg, worked on the presidential campaigns for Richard Nixon and Barry Goldwater. So what you have up here are the people working with Ronald Reagan, George Dumaijian, Richard Nixon, Barry Goldwater, the huge oil companies, and Pete Wilson, all as a combine, which is what I warned about and talked about last week. Now, along those lines and getting to oil companies, there's been the indictment of a man from Pebble Beach who is close to William Rogers of the shuttle group of Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan and Clint Eastwood in that crowd. His name is Darius Keaton. You may have seen his name in the news. The Los Angeles Times has a huge article how the Security Exchange broke a huge stock case. It's a page and a half in the whole newspaper, so that's why I say it's big, and it's about the arrest of Darius Keaton. The investigation has gone on for a long time. Now, in 1981, I was doing broadcasts on the murder of Anwar Sadat in Egypt, the relationship of Mr. Mubarak to George Bush, being with him in Washington just 2 days before he flew to Egypt, and Sadat was murdered, and the politics of that murder and the money scandals and weapons scandals involved. Well, the Los Angeles Times cites this current article about Darius Keaton from Pebble Beach about the sale of stock. It involves a company, Santa Fe International, which is part of Alhambra Oil Company in Los Angeles, and it was being purchased by Kuwait Petroleum Company from the Kuwait government. And the announcement of the purchase was October the 5th, 1981, and Gerald Ford was one of the big stockholders there, and he's a close friend of Darius Keaton, and Ford isn't even named in these current articles as being indicted and getting profit. But October the 5th, 1981, Kuwait government bought a California firm, Alhambra Oil Company, and Anwar Sadat was murdered 1 day later on October the 6th, and the sale 4 days later of the purchase of that stock involved, the newspaper cites, if you owned $8,700 of stock option in the oil company, Santa Fe, before it was purchased by Kuwait on October the 5th, you made $911,000 profit in 4 days. Now, the Security Exchange Commission was anxious to see who was doing this because it is one of the biggest insider trading cases in the history of the Security Exchange Commission. And remember how close William Casey was to the Security Exchange Commission. But the article of the indictments and Darius Keaton began after about a 4-year investigation. In January the 17th, 1986, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal, ex-director of Santa Fe International, accused of insider trading in takeover. And this is important because of the link to Clint Eastwood, Pete Wilson, William Rogers, Henry Kissinger, and Gerald Ford as a combined and relationship or close friendship and working relationship, maybe Eastwood not with them, but part of that milieu with the oil operators running his campaign here in California. And in the Wall Street Journal in January this year, they said that Darius N. Keaton, Santa Fe director, has been indicted, along with a Jordanian associate, that they made a profit of $4.9 million by trading their Santa Fe stocks and options in the weeks before the Kuwait Petroleum announced to buy the Alhambra Company in California. He only made $4.9 billion, and it was based on inside knowledge. The Monterey Herald had a story January the 10th on Mr. Darius Keaton, and it tells how he built his oil career out of the oil industry after World War II, closely connected to key political and industry figures around the world, including the late Shah of Iran, and William Rogers of the Commission investigation of the Challenger was the attorney for the Shah of Iran after he was Secretary of State and represented the Shah, and that's the law office also of William Casey. And he was president of Japan. He was close to the president of Japan's Mitsubishi International and the sheikhs of Kuwait and some of the wealthiest oil nations in the Middle East. And the article goes on to say that Darius Keaton is a friend of former President Gerald Ford, who stays at his Pebble Beach home. The home is owned by Keaton's Charter Oil Company, and when Gerald Ford is here and plays golf, he was always close to them. As a matter of fact, the Crosby, the national yearly annual Crosby tournament, was changed. Its name was changed because Catherine Crosby didn't want the involvement of Mr. Keaton at Pebble Beach anymore, and she blamed him for a lot of things that were going on there. At the Crosby tournament this past year, the name was taken off. She didn't want any part of it. Then he arranged for American Telephone and Telegraph to sponsor the golf tournament. February 27, 1986, Wall Street Journal and Washington Post have a story. Security Exchange probe ends in big recovery, and the investigation got back $7.8 million in a fraud case involving these very people, and the Swiss banks broke some of their stories and went beyond the secrecy so that they could get this story out and find out who was responsible for this huge fraud. And as they say, the foreknowledge, the important thing was the shift in power in the Middle East when Mubarak was in, and the relationship to Kuwait that was triggered off by the Sadat murder, that really, it was the interim of those 4 days where the purchase took place, Sadat was murdered, and then 4 days later the stock went up, and this was a huge $2.5 billion takeover of Santa Fe International by the Kuwait government. And a lot of the funding was done in Liechtenstein, of course, and Swiss bank accounts, and involved huge holdings in the Middle East and subsidiaries in London and so forth. But the main point is that over here in Pebble Beach, there has been this scandal going for 4 years, and Gerald Ford from the Warren Commission, close to William Rogers, and those people have been intertwined. Henry Kissinger has been behind every major coup that has taken place in this country, and particularly for the oil dealing of the Shah of Iran and overthrowing, early in his career, Mossadegh for Standard Oil and putting in the Shah of Iran, and then the arrangement, the death of Sadat, and the oil manipulators made a big killing, but this time they didn't get away with it. Now, when William Rogers was selected to head the commission to investigate the Challenger, there was a big headline in the San Francisco Chronicle, "No axe to grind." That's Ronald Reagan's way of saying he'll be very impartial with no bias, whatever, with no axe to grind. William Rogers, I've talked about him for quite a few weeks on and off, was the Attorney General under President Eisenhower from 1957 to 61. He was Secretary of State under President Nixon, Crook Nixon, from 69 to 73, and he is a partner in the law firm of Rogers and Wells in New York City, which is the law firm of William Casey of the Central Intelligence Agency. Last week I mentioned the law office of William Rogers and Wells and Casey because 4 people investigating, in quotes, investigating in control of the shuttle scandal that will keep it from being pressure in the White House. All of them come from the National Security Council, the CIA, the Pentagon, and NASA, so that the control of the investigation is very tight because of these given people that I cited last week. There's Alton Keel, Thomas Reinhardt, Mark Weinberg, and Herbert Hay-Too. All of them from the Office of Management Budget, all of them very tight with the White House, going back and forth to the White House, and therefore there can be no impartial investigation of pressure. So now they have to pressure Dan Rather and CBS as being the cause of the shuttle going up and being forced by the media to prove they could launch and not have to postpone the launches. Now, a friend of mine, a listener to World Watchers, a long friend, sent me a page or several pages from a book published by Amnesty International. I just referred to it last week briefly. The book is called Torture in Greece, and this is part of the first torture trials in 1975, and the book was published in 1977, Amnesty International, and it cites that William Rogers, Secretary of State William Rogers, defended the Greek regime before the U.S. Congress, and the Congress, lacking at the time adequate parliamentary human rights machinery, wasn't able to restrain the executive branch of the government in Greece with their torture, murder, and imprisonments. The Greek military junta was put in by the Office of Management Budget under the cover of Litton Industry by our Defense Department, and this is very important because the chief investigator or two from the shuttle, which is really a coup of a kind where you're taking over the United States shuttle program and turning it to the Star Wars, to the Defense Department, away from the civilian. It's the escalation of a coup. They come from the Office of Management Budget, and it was under the cloak of Office of Management Budget that the Greek military junta was put into power, and William Rogers was the attorney defending them, and Litton Industry was the major corporation that was the cover for the military to get their spies in. So Rogers has a history going back to military dictatorships and so forth. Now, getting to California, to William Rogers of the law firm of Rogers and Wells, the William Casey offices, February 22nd, 1986, there was an article in the Los Angeles Times, which didn't go over the wire services, at least I didn't see it in any of your services, William Rogers was appointed by the president on February the 2nd. So 20 days later, this is the article in the Los Angeles Times. It's titled, New York Law Firm Agrees to Settle J. David Suits. This has to do with a $40 million agreement that has been signed by the law office of William Rogers, not because he represented J. David Dominelli, an investor and a crook, but because he was part of the business of the office. And this takes William Rogers out to California, to San Diego, California, the hometown of Pete Wilson and many other people that I'll cite. The article says that the law office of Rogers and Wells, headed by the former U.S. Secretary of State William Rogers, who is now heading a blue ribbon panel investigating the Space Shuttle Challenger. Rogers and Wells also represented J. David and Company. That was the name of the company. David is Dominelli, J. David Dominelli. That was fraud-ridden, R-I-D-D-E-N. They have agreed to pay the law office, William Rogers, $40 million involving 30 lawsuits brought on by the investors. This is the largest settlement of a law firm, not J. David Dominelli himself, but the law firm is going to settle a $40 million lawsuit. The investors wanted more than $120 million from the firm. They allege that William Rogers and Wells aided the fraud by representing the firm's founder, J. David Dominelli, even after they discovered that their foreign currency trading activity was illegal, that they didn't drop it and tell their clients, stop doing what you're doing, it's illegal. They allowed them to siphon these millions out of the country, some more of those floating missing millions, that they continued to represent them even knowing that the activities were illegal. So just gather that kind of a contradiction where the law office is part of the problem, like we know you're cheating, but we're with you all the way. The article goes on, Mr. Dominelli is in prison. The company, of course, is being liquidated, and there was a 22-page settlement in San Diego, which the judge, Ben Hamrick, ordered sealed. Of course, it involves the Casey office and William Rogers, so nobody can see what went on, and we should. With CIA director running so many things, we should be able to see it. The article says no plaintiff or defendant can discuss it. May the 13th, 1986 is the date set for the lawsuit against William Rogers, and this is coming up just a month from yesterday, the Rogers and Wells law firm, and they reportedly were paid $900,000 for working for Dominelli. They have insurance of less than $80 million, and they have to pay a fine of $40 million. The J. David settlement of $40 million, which is concealed, staying in concealed documents, the agreement was that it stay sealed, is not included, this $40 million is not included in the settlement of the case. There are law firms that will take this to the courts, and San Diego courts will hear it, and there are also law cases taking place in Chicago. J. David and Company attracted $200 million from 15,000 investors. They promised a return of 40%. $82 million was lost by investors. Can you take out of the country $82 million in the hands of William Rogers and William Casey and not put in Swiss banks and come back and buy up some American corporations or broadcasting like ABC or whatever? Where does that money go? Dominelli was ordered 20 years in prison, and the law firm knew that the firm was selling unregistered securities, that they were acting illegally for a whole year before the investors themselves went bankrupt. Can you imagine if you had $200 million and the law firm of Rogers and Casey, that it could go to Liechtenstein and Swiss banks or goodness knows where, and could be given to certain people to buy up corporations, or even for capital cities, Casey's, to buy up ABC Broadcasting. This money comes from investors in San Diego who put up the money. The company goes bankrupt, and for a year they were doing unregistered securities with William Rogers' law firm before the investors caught on. In January 1983, the Rogers and Wells law office represented Dominelli in London. They urged the San Diego office, people in London urged them to tell Dominelli to stop trading his foreign currency accounts, and a partner, Johnny Nelson, a partner, charged Rogers and Wells and the London office because of security violations. and he broke off with Rogers and Wells. Now, William Rogers' office in San Diego continued to represent the firm in La Jolla, California. La Jolla, San Diego, and La Costa are three areas that are very, very close, like Pebble Beach, Carmel, and Big Sur. Del Mar and the racetrack there are also a part right in that center milieu. They all just run and flow together, and they're very important. The offices of William Rogers and the William Casey offices pumped money from investors into this firm, even though they had been told to stop doing the trading and so forth, and the former investors now allege that the bulk of J. David fraud could have never happened without the work of William Rogers and Wells, the illegal activity of the law offices. It couldn't have happened, and that's why they're asking that law firm to give the largest settlement of any law office in the United States, $40 million. The New York Times has a shorter article. For those of you that want to look it up, it's dated February 22nd, 1986. A.J. David Law Firm settles malpractice suit. This article cites that William Rogers Law Office and Wells have agreed to a $40 million settlement with investors who charge that the law firm was involved with security fraud, negligence, and malpractice. And they cited the collapse of this J. David firm in 1984. Robert Meyer, an attorney for Loeb & Loeb in Los Angeles who represents plaintiffs who lost $28 million in the scheme, was the chief investigator for the case. The settlement has been filed in the state superior court, it says, under seal and so forth, and they will review the problem of 300 investors who lost more than $100 million. 330 investors, rather, lost $100 million down the drain. And it goes on to say that Rogers and Wells was the top New York law firm that was sued because Mr. Dominelli admitted in court that the scheme, which promised investors returns on an investment pool set up to speculate on foreign currency markets, was a fraud from its inception. Now look at the security exchange record of William Casey at the time of Watergate and their work with Robert Vesco and investment overseas, and also William Rogers' involvement with these people. Here is $100 million from 330 people, and William Rogers and Casey's law office knew it was a fraud from the inception. Dominelli was sentenced in June to 20 years in federal prison for fraud, income tax, and so forth, but he contended that Rogers and Wells was accountable for the actions of its clients. Although individuals and other law accounting firms that worked with Mr. Dominelli and San Diego companies have been named in the suits, Rogers and Wells was the primary target in litigation because it was Mr. Dominelli's principal law firm. The article goes on to say Rogers and Wells agreement, which sources said was the result of 4 months of negotiations, does not involve the litigation pending against the other law offices and the firms, accounting firms. Rogers and Wells has filed a cross complaint. So this has been going on for 4 months before he was announced to be the head of the shuttle program, and he's proven to be, or he wouldn't be charged with $40 million of fraudulently siphoning off $100 million that he and Casey and their gang can use for goodness knows what. The New York Times says lawyers close to the case said the agreement had been negotiated by the Rogers and Wells partners that included former Secretary of State William Rogers, now heading the President's Council, investigating the space shuttle disaster. The $40 million payment will be covered by Rogers and Wells, as I say, with their $70 million insurance, and therefore they won't have to go through a trial or, according to the New York Times, the publicity of a trial. Now, another fellow that is important to this case just decided this past week that he wants to come home, being as Rogers and Wells have settled out of court. The Los Angeles Times has a story. Ex-executive for J. David wants to end 2-year exile, and this has to do with a gentleman living in London by the name of Mark Yerry. He acknowledged he participated in various security law violations. He was a major money raiser, getting that $100 million for the fraudulent J. David offices, and he in San Diego, and now he wants to come back after his 2-year exile. We'll take a 1-minute break, and then I'll continue with this and go into some more of the scandals of William Rogers, William Casey, and the siphoning off of millions and many more millions of money. This is Mae Brussell, the second half of World Watchers, in case you just turned on the radio in the middle of that first half and don't understand what this is. It's a 1-hour analysis of particular events that are taking place in the news, and this is broadcast number 749, the second half of the program. I ended the other a minute ago describing telling you about a man named Mark Yarry, Y-A-R-R-Y, who's lived in London 2 years. He went away when Mr. Dominelli was arrested. He was one of the fundraisers for this $100 million scam where the money left the country. He left for Europe after J. David collapsed in 1984, early 84. He's 46 years old, and for the first time he'll discuss the inner workings and his role in the company and his relationship with J. David Dominelli, the La Jolla investment firm that attracted $200 million from 1,500 investors. There's quite a difference. One is 330 investors and 100 million, and this particular article says 200 million, which makes it even worse when he describes the 200 million. And they said they were promised 40% increase on their annual returns. And also, when the scandal broke, it involved the removal in San Diego to another person very close to Pete Wilson, the San Diego mayor, Roger Hedgecock, because in 1983 his campaign was secretly bankrolled by J. David. Now, when Pete Wilson of San Diego ran for office, he was married to a lady, and he separated from her and moved in with some investors whose names were never mentioned. And I did broadcast on Pete Wilson wanting to know who was funding the senator, because he's become so prominent in the company of William Rogers, Gerald Ford, Henry Kissinger, and those people that Dominelli and the big bucks that he was floating in when he ran for senator against Jerry Brown out here in California. And again, if you think these are California problems, we only have 100 senators, and one of them is yours, and it's Pete Wilson. Okay, Dominelli, getting back to the LA Times article, Dominelli admitted that he invested virtually none of the client's funds, that he lost $82 million in investor money, and Mr. Yarry, as I said, wants to come home and tell what happened. Now, in addition to possible security law violations, authorities are probing Yarry's secret Swiss bank account in which he named Sebastian after his cat, which is very nice. And they give a figure purported in the Swiss accounts, but it isn't even worth repeating because I'm sure it must be 1,000 times larger or not definable considering how much money went away. But the account was under the name of his cat, and he owes back income taxes in the United States. Then it goes on, Mr. Yarry's checkered past includes selling inexpensive diamonds, and this gets back to the gemstone scam that Bruce Roberts told me about, and I won't digress to that at the time of the Watergate scandals. He practiced medicine without a license, and he posed as a mafiosa to break a British counterfeit ring in Scotland Yard. He authored a book on commodities training, and he claims to have crossed the Swiss and Italian Alps. The reason practicing medicine without a license is so important is that because at the time of the Watergate entries, the GOP was campaigning in Beverly Hills, California that night of the entry into the Democratic headquarters, and they were at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and they quickly packed everybody up and moved down to La Costa in California, at which time Martha Mitchell picked up the phone and called Helen Thomas in Washington, and because she knew the Watergate people that were arrested and talked about the mafia connections to the White House. She was taken by Herbert Kalmbach under an alias disguised as his wife to a hospital. They were down in San Diego and got an injection in her butt, and 3 years later died of this terrible cancer where her bones disintegrated, a disease similar to AIDS. Now, while all this scandal is going on, this past week, March 28th, 1986, there's a story in the LA Herald on the AP wire service. Tax swindler Dominelli suffers a stroke in prison. That's just days after the Rogers, Wells, Casey outfit is mentioned as settling a $40 million scandal February 22nd. So March 28th, just 26 days later, Dominelli has one of those famous strokes, similar to the kind of sickness that Michele Sindona had, but he also had a little stroke later. He got a serious stroke a month later, and the wire service in L.A. Herald said convicted swindler J. David Dominelli, he was conscious, recovering from a mild stroke in prison. He's serving a 20-year sentence for fraud and so forth. He pleaded guilty in 1985. In March 85, Mr. Hardy, who was handling the case of the federal government, concerned about him, said he was not aware that Dominelli was ailing until he was informed of the stroke. He didn't know that this particular person was sick until he was informed of the stroke Wednesday afternoon, and he was rushed to Valley Memorial Hospital in Livermore, California, near San Francisco. Earlier this week, attorneys representing investors who have sued Dominelli met with him at the Federal Correctional Center, Pleasant, California, and they wanted to get a videotape deposition, but he refused. He also had suffered a stroke in San Diego in 1984, and as a result of that stroke, he lost most of his ability to speak for several months. The therapists have worked with him, and now he's had another stroke, and it goes on to say that he illegally financed the mayoral campaign of Roger Hedgecock in San Diego. So I think, again, to cite the power that came in to run the mayoral campaign of Little Carmel, California, with 30 countries represented here, considering the milieu and the oil people that ran that, just keep your eyes open. As California goes, so goes the nation. Now, a man who's in the news, and I do want to do 1 or 2 or 3 hours on him, is Lyndon LaRouche, and he's very controversial. I have several people that bust a gut. If I mention his name, I'm going to cite part of an article of his from Executive Intelligence Review that involves San Diego because of the milieu in San Diego around the politics taking place in the past 40 years and the kinds of people we're talking about that have law offices in New York but that work in San Diego. And there are a lot of people that think that even if his material is right, you shouldn't cite him because he's a fascist. I think Ronald Reagan is a fascist and Edwin Meese is a fascist, and I think Dan Rather and Cronkite and all of them, the man most trusted in America, Mr. Cronkite, I wouldn't trust him at all. They lied about the coup in this country. They lied about the murder of Kennedy, and they offer no information such as Lyndon LaRouche's magazines do, and I'm very grateful for the subscription I have to it. Now, I'm going to cite just a page from a current thing he has to show you the milieu in San Diego. In San Diego is the basis of C. Arnold Smith, another crook who was indicted, who took away millions and millions of dollars, who was behind the career of Richard Nixon from the days of Navy intelligence, and ran him in 1946 and became a House of Representatives, a senator, a vice president. After the 2 Kennedys were murdered, he was back as president, where he wanted to be. The Lincoln Club, the Lockheed Corporations in California, and the San Diego nest of C. Arnold Smith was behind the Nixon. John DeLorean had a home in San Diego for good reason, and he worked closely with William Hetrick, who flew down to South America. And I still want to know more about that cocaine that was in the hotel that Hetrick had and the relationship to John DeLorean, and if that, in fact, was the money from the cocaine that Barbie sent to the Joseph Mengele account because of the San Diego connections of DeLorean and Hetrick, and I'll continue to tie those again more in a few moments. Now, Mr. J. Dominelli worked in San Diego and funded the political career of these people down there, including a mayor who had to leave office, and worked closely with William Rogers of New York City and William Casey's law office, and this was the San Diego branch. And why would they siphon if it's 1,500 people and 200 million? Where did it go, and does the CIA take a little bit from everybody, declare bankruptcy, and put in the pocket of covert operations or private oil deals? Now, down in that area, as I say, is La Costa, where Martha Mitchell was when she was taken to a hospital injected. Was this particular guy from J. David Dominelli, was he the one who, as a disguise, gave her the shot in the behind? We don't know, but it's certainly interesting to ask what Mr. Mark Yerry was doing disguised as a doctor and what he did or practiced in San Diego as an investor crook, holding needles or injecting as a doctor, because out of La Costa comes that Modalit's relationship. It was set up by the Teamsters from Las Vegas money. The Teamsters were the only union that supported Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, And the head of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Robert Blakey, is the lawyer and close friend and the personal friend of Mo Dallas, as is Paul Laxalt, being pushed as the next president. And down at Del Mar, California, comes J. Edgar Hoover. Close ties every year with Clint Murchison, who set up the assassination death squads in the United States, and Hoover of Division 5 of the FBI, part of the Permandex hit team, along with Murchison and political assassinations that met down in Del Mar. La Costa, Mo Dallas from Vegas, and Del Mar, J. Edgar Hoover and Murchison, and DeLorean's nest down there with South American and international and Vatican connections. See Arnold Smith with Nixon. And out of that team comes Pete Wilson, the senator who Kissinger Ford campaigned for, close to the Rogers law offices are represented, Dominelli, and Jay Dominelli's work with the multi-million-dollar scandal, the $200 million. Let's go for the top figure. It's probably more than that. And the very law office has been named William Rogers himself. And so that there's a nest of people that goes up and down this coast, and then, of course, east to affect, and around the world to affect the whole world. Now, Lyndon LaRouche has an article titled "Who's Who in the Pollard Case." It's from Executive Intelligence Review, and it has to do with the arrest of Jonathan J. Pollard, who went to Stanford University. He was a roommate of Jonathan Marshall of Libertarian Party, and I want to do more on that one of these days. And he was a spy even at Stanford University. And this article is about the Pollard case because the head of the Mossad, the former head of the Mossad in Israel, Rafi Eitan, E-Y-T-A-N, was the agent in charge of information that Pollard was supposed to be taking from Navy intelligence in the United States. Now, Eitan's name has been mentioned on other broadcasts I've done because he met in February of 1985 in Bonn, Germany, with Robert Ernest Kaiser. Kaiser, close to, he worked with the Wehrmacht, Hitler's army in the war, close to the CIA, the Defense Department, part of the assassination teams and death squads. And those two men were in Bonn, Germany, saying that Kaiser was offering to bring in Joseph Mengele alive in 1985. And Eitan, Dirty Rafi, has been saying continuously that Mengele is not dead. So we're talking about the state of mind of these people and who they work with. But Eitan also, besides working with Robert Kaiser in Bonn, Germany, and part of the Mossad intelligence, is linked to, is the cutoff man with Jonathan J. Pollard. And in the course of describing Eitan, the Executive Intelligence Review said that Eitan is a lifelong Mossad operative with a specialty in assassinations. He's a cousin of the former Mossad spy master. He was recruited into the Mossad in 1950 into the Israeli intelligence. He was part of their internal intelligence. He rose rapidly in the Mossad. He was appointed the head of the clandestine operations, which was the assassination operations in Western Europe, and also it was Robert Ernest Kaiser, his co-partner that he was meeting with in Germany, who was hired to kill William Taub at the time of the Watergate scandals involving Nixon and Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters, and making Fitzsimmons and the other team, they became a political ball, and the agreement was to wipe out Hoffa and let the next group take over, and he was supposed to kill Taub, who was close to Hoffa. The article goes on, following his work with the Mossad in Israel, in 1972, he moved to San Diego, California, for a man named Amnon Barness, A-M-M-O-N, B-A-R-N-E-S-S, who ran the Dalen Drug Company, a San Diego-based intelligence front. It's now in Panama, and I will continue maybe next week or the week after under the new Nazi regime coming into Panama that was part of the Adolf Hitler regime that LaRouche has been exposing. The gentleman is in Panama now, but Dalen Drugs was the cover for Rafi Eitan, Dirty Rafi, in San Diego, the milieu, when just at the time of the Watergate arrest in 1972. Now, it was in San Diego in 1972 that Squad 19 was going to plan to kill Richard Nixon. The Los Angeles Police Department, Squad 19, was to kill Nixon at the time of the nomination and declare martial law in the United States and have Spiro Agnew linked to the Greek Nazis put in by OMB and the Defense Department with William Rogers as their attorney and make Spiro Agnew president of the United States. That was to take place in the summer of 1972 in San Diego. And Mr. Rafi Eitan from the Mossad was down there in San Diego in 1972 working for Dayland Drug Company, which was an intelligent front, and Mr. Amon Barnes now lives in Panama. And this goes on to say Barnes has been detailed to the United States. He was here in 1947 as an officer of the Haganah, the Israeli organization. In 1957, Barnes became a chief financial officer of the newly formed Permindex Corporation, which has been identified with joint assassination bureaus that directed the murder of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, they said, among other strategic assassinations. The man that brought Rafi Eitan to San Diego in 1972, when Nixon was going to be murdered, to make ready for Agnew, was the member of the Permindex operation that had done away with the two Kennedys and Martin Luther King, 1963, and two of them in 1968, one at the Ambassador Hotel, Robert Kennedy, owned by David Schein, co-partner of Roy Cohn of Permindex. Roy Cohn is part of Permindex and the assassination team. And then in the 1970s, under the Dayland Company, Eitan was working in the United States, building up his network of organized crime and working in the Defense Department and with Navy intelligence and Israeli intelligence, and was working with Jonathan J. Pollard. So that is part of the San Diego team at the time that the Permindex operators were planning one more operation to make Agnew in. The trick of history was that the Scotch tape at the Watergate Hotel broke open the whole story, and the investors into that coup or into the GOP had only until April for secrecy to invest in the elections, and after that the fundings were public. So the money for the coup was blown because the money went to Marriott hotels. If you don't remember, they were paying off the GOP, and the elections were to be decided by the nomination in the hotel in San Diego. And when Jack Anderson broke the story of Dita Baird and the funding operations, the nominations were moved to Miami, and they didn't have time between the spring and the summer of 72 to raise the kind of money to get a military coup d'etat like they had in Dallas, and it fell through. And as soon as Nixon was caught with the Watergate thing, he removed Spiro Agnew so that that line of succession didn't flow, and then he put Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission as his vice president, and then when he was out, a member of the Warren Commission became president and put Nelson Rockefeller as vice president. So that is the milieu of San Diego. Now, another story involving New York City and William Rogers and the Casey offices is even more scandalous, considering that Casey has gotten away with so much with his mafia, investment overseas, Robert Vesco, Security Exchange, John Mitchell. He was OSS, CIA, a Knight of Malta. You can't touch William Casey. And now he's escalating his power in Afghanistan, Angola, in Central America. He's a disease that should be removed surgically or some way. But his offices continue to be exposed, and the President of the United States appoints William Rogers of that outfit to head the shuttle investigation, which involves Nazis. And again, the President has put in William Rogers, who is covering up the Nazis from Huntsville, Alabama, that are going to get their new space shuttle, that are going into the Star Wars. They're going to put their colonies on the moon. They're going to have their $800 billion for Mars. All of the things they wanted followed after the Challenger was blown up. Instead of changing office, the people from Huntsville, NASA, the old von Braun team, the Walter Dornberger crew that are there today, that inherited the mantle, they were named in the Torva document along with Roy Cohn and these same Permindex operators as 1/5 of a branch of Permindex, along with that other part of J. Edgar Hoover and Division 5 and Clint Murchison, and the meeting places in Del Mar, California. So this law office now comes in another scandal while he hands over, as I say, the Star Wars, the moon colonies, the Mars operations to the people in Huntsville and to Rockwell International. Also, remember now that Mr. Deaver, Michael Deaver, and there's so many scandals around him, is the public relations man for Rockwell International at a time where they'll get more billions to make more shuttles and more Star Wars, and Deaver was the man who bowed out of White House service, by presenting the president to the cemetery of the Waffen-SS at Bitburg, his last grand act for himself and Nancy Reagan before he went to be an agent for the South Korean government, for Saudi Arabia, and for Rockwell International, among other things. Now, the article that is so interesting I'm going to cite now, it comes from the San Francisco Chronicle and the New York, it's the Chicago Tribune, not the New York Times, but it may have been printed in your other papers. I don't know if it was or not. New York frontmen detail secret Marcos deals, and many of you read about the Bernstein family and the deals of investing their money in New York City. And this article may be a little different than what you've seen. It may repeat some, and most of it, I hope, is new. It says former Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos and his wife owned 4 commercial buildings in New York City, and we are familiar with those. The Crown Building on Fifth Avenue, the Herald Center, the shopping complex on Madison Avenue, and a building at 40 Wall Street. She looked at that building, thought it was nice, gave the investors $130 or $40 million, $120 million to buy a restaurant, and went around town buying up things for New York City. And the people testifying about this are Joseph and Ralph Bernstein, who acted as the trustee for Mr. and Mrs. Marcos in buying this, and they used Swiss bank accounts. And the article goes on, the Bernsteins grew up in the Philippines and live in New York. They said their dealings began in the fall of 1981. Of course, as soon as Ronald Reagan, a close friend of the Marcos, was president, he was inaugurated in January of 81, the big splash could get going, and here comes Mr. Casey, the CIA director, a good pal, all the way back to all these people. And Casey's name has been thrown around on documents involving that false energy, Saudi Arabia energy money that the Marcos scammed out that they were supposed to be building, and William Casey worked for the Security Exchange Commission. So he's linked to the Marcos money scam in the Philippines, and still, if President Reagan is the Teflon, Casey is the Teflon also, because of his involvement in the Philippines. And you read it once, hear it once on TV, and you think it'll splash like Watergate, and then it goes away. This article goes on, Joseph Bernstein, an attorney, said his New York law office established a corporation in the Netherlands Antilles. Of course, that's a big place for Mark Rich, the partner of Henry Kissinger, and Marvin Davis. The Netherlands Antilles is not so big, but it carries a lot of weight for investments. And they use this haven for an offshore company at the request of Tanco. They call it TANTCO. The company was used in the purchase of the Crown Building on Fifth Avenue, the skyscraper, for around $51 million. The building is now appraised at $101 million. It's doubled in these 5 years. The transaction was further concealed in 3 separate holding companies in Panama. And this is like the Vatican losing $1.2 billion around Panama on these companies. It said each one held 1/3 interest in the building through anonymous bearer shares. The Panamanian companies enabled the owners to avoid paying New York state property taxes. So the Bernsteins, who grew up in the Philippines, don't want Mr. and Mrs. Marcos to pay New York City. You could clean up a little bit of the subway, you could clean the streets, get rid of the garbage and get some clean air, but those taxes are avoided by setting up 3 Panama companies. And they said a similar arrangement was made when they bought the 3 other buildings. Goodness knows that Marcos would pay taxes in New York City, so they put it under a Panamanian name. Most of the financing was provided by a Swiss bank, represented by Rogers and Wells of the New York law firm, which former Secretary of State William Rogers is a partner, and William Casey, director of the Central Intelligence Agency. They describe him as a former partner because he has a job in the federal government as director of the intelligence agency. But he goes back. He has the same clients. In 1981, when the president was inaugurated, just when Casey was being considered as director of the CIA, they are setting up money that goes to Switzerland and down to Panama in 3 offices with anonymous names to buy up places in New York City that have doubled in value. If they put in $316 million in just those 4 buildings, then they have $636 million value right now with no taxes, arranged by a member of the cabinet of the President of the United States. Now, we have heard on the air. Lyndon LaRouche was put down by the mass media, and Ronald Reagan said it was absolutely ridiculous that a member of his cabinet, the chief of staff, Donald Reagan, who was Secretary of the Treasury, was involved in mob money. The court records show it. As of 1982, the Merrill Lynch connections to the the mozzarella pizza money to Tomasi Buscetta, to the heroin traffic. The records show E.F. Hutton funneled this money, and the president of E.F. Hutton is the brother-in-law of George Bush, Barbara Bush's brother. These denials that this takes place, this is the most corrupt cabinet. The Donovan case is going up soon. Raymond Donovan, Secretary of Labor. The entire cabinet, Paul Laxalt, the chief fundraiser from the Senate, from the territory of the Nevada, all mafia, all scandalous in the operations that have taken place in the years, and then that team, a hunk of it, moves down to San Diego and becomes very influential there. This article from the Chicago Tribune said Peter Williams, a partner in the firm, said that an affidavit released to the subcommittee said that they met with Marcos October of 81, with Imelda Marcos 2 weeks after, to discuss the renovation of the Crown building and so forth. Now that is really scandalous that the law offices of Rogers and Wells and Casey arrange these Swiss Panamanian scams so that those poor people in New York City don't have the money to improve the city. The taxes don't go to New York State or city or federal. I imagine they arranged tax scams for Fernando Marcos, and this is a man on the cabinet of the President of the United States. There are times when you think that I would stop being shocked, but I still am shocked at all of this. Now, you might have read a small article, an obituary. I didn't see it in the major papers, but maybe they came late, and I'll see them now. James Crosby died this past week, April the 11th. James Crosby. The Monterey Herald had a short story. New Jersey casino official, Atlantic City, James Crosby, who transferred a paint company, that's the Mary Carter Paint Company, into the Giant Resorts International, died Thursday at New York University Hospital following respiratory surgery. He was 58 years old. He was chairman of Resorts International, and he came to Atlantic City in the spring of '76, and it goes on. He bought the Chalfont Haddon Hall, one of the old hotels. Now, today, the Wall Street Journal, April 14th, has a long story. Death of Resorts International's Crosby leaves control of the casino firm uncertain. And I must go on to say, because I won't have time to finish this evening, that I'll get back to, and I've been promising to repeat, the sections of Jeff Gerst's article in Sundance that came out December of '72 after Watergate, of the links of Mr. Crosby, of Mary Carter Paint Company, and Richard Nixon, and William Rogers, and Will Wilson of Texas, and John Connolly on the board of Permandex, and Bibi Rabosa, and their links to the Caribbean, to organized crime, to Nixon and Rogers' career when he was Deputy Attorney General in December '53. They're purchasing money and property down in the Bahamas. In their work with Senator Joe McCarthy and the beginning of the whole Cold War, their links to G. Meyer Shine and David Shine, as I say, the one who owns the Ambassador Hotel where Robert Kennedy was to be murdered in 1968 by Permandex. And I'll share with you, some of you have the Sundance article, some of you don't, the role of William Rogers, our current investigator of the shuttle program, with Richard Nixon, part of the Permandex operation that murdered John Kennedy, the career of Rogers and Casey and the Security Exchange Commission, dirty dealing. This was all out in 1972, earlier and long after. The swindling and the dealing, and this article goes into Jimmy Hoffa's desires, and then, of course, Ernest Kaiser was used to try to kill William Taub, and because of his relationship and close relationship to Jimmy Hoffa. Getting back to the Wall Street Journal article briefly, it says how James Crosby died. They don't know about his will. He was the head of Resorts International, and now the Wall Street analysts are saying the stock will increase because he held back on it. And maybe I'll detail this for you next week. But the interesting thing is that Mr. Crosby's sister, Suzanne Murphy, is the wife of Thomas S. Murphy, chairman of Capital Cities ABC. Capital Cities was founded by OSS, CIA, Knights of Malta, William Casey, who worked closely with Robert Vesco and that whole gang, and the chairman of Capital Cities ABC, Thomas Murphy, is married to the sister of James Crosby of Mary Carter Paint Company, the Resorts International, and they made millions of dollars, of course, from investment overseas, and that web is so tangled I can't do that and finish up in 1 minute. I'll get back to it next week, but here we have Casey, law office with William Rogers, and of course close to not only the news media now with a hunk owning ABC, but close to Resorts International and the crowd that go way back to the career of William Rogers and Richard Nixon. I'll continue with some of this next week. In the meantime, again, thanks for the many articles, many books, and things you're sending me. I really appreciate it, and this is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you in one more week to continue along with some of this.